allow us anything stronger during office hours.
And he fed me on a good diet of optimality theory and I forget what else. Right? And then eventually became my supervisor for my PhD. Right? Both gentlemen are, I think, slightly younger than me, but I regard them as my seniors actually on a linguistic level. So I think these two are fully adequate to begin a debate on nativism versus empiricism in linguistics, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy it. The way that it will be structured is each will get, starting with Mark, each will get about 20 to 25 minutes to give a position paper, if you will. Mark will present basically a nativist position, as far as I understand, and Bertus will then counter as best he can with an empiricist position. Each contender will then get another, say, 10 or 15 minutes to provide a response, if you will, and then the floor will be open. Right? At that stage, if I could ask delegates to either direct questions to either of the two or to both. If a question is directed, for example, to Mark, I will then allow Bertus an opportunity to respond as well. Right? Just so that it doesn't get completely chaotic, right? Which it could. Right? There is a whiteboard if anyone wants to do trees. It's still a possibility. Right? And at the end, I'll allow each contender to then also wrap up about, say, 10 minutes. I think that would be a nice way to handle matters. So if anybody is ready, we can begin with Mark.
Thank you very much. And I actually don't know if I'm going to stand or sit, so I might just bob up and down. But I have been preparing by watching lots of ETV. And I just want to warn the chair that according to WWE rules, the chairs are part of the game. Okay. You will have front row seats. Be careful. Right. So what I'm going to do is just start off with the intellectual puzzle about what is it that motivates the whole Chomsky versus the rest debate, if you like. So I'm going to be outlining the basic nativist position, or what I'm also going to call it the biolinguistic position. And that word comes from a conference around 1975 on the biology of language, at which both Luria and Chomsky were in attendance. So that's kind of where I want to go through. And outline a number of, let's call them biolinguistic questions, which are research questions that define the object of study. And the first one will be Humboldt's problem: what is knowledge of language, and what we need to represent or analyze that knowledge. And the second will be Plato's problem: where does all this apparatus come from? And of course, I'll be arguing that it's in your head. Right? So we'll imagine it's in your head. Yeah. Okay. And then we'll just see where we go off if we have time to add anything else. So the question of how we acquire new knowledge and learn new things is something that has puzzled people for several thousand years. What makes it interesting is there's this difference, it seems, between some things which are acquired like really easily and some things which take considerably more effort. So for instance, if you look at language, you can see that all children acquire language to a similar level of competence, irrespective of overt instruction, intelligence, richness of linguistic exposure, etc. Right? So that should sound kind of, that's a nativist question. And so what do we mean by that? Well, for instance, they have very large, but maybe not quite identical vocabularies. They've got ability to use a wide range of constructions. So, for instance, all children can make questions. They can do raising. They can do exceptional case marking, passives, head movement, quantify raising, and any number of other constructions that they can do. And they are able to distinguish well-formed from non-well-formed sentences. And this allows them to be creative. Right? They can just use language and produce these well-formed sentences, which allows them to say novel things, which they probably have not heard before. And all this wouldn't be that interesting if it weren't for the case that there are obvious domains of human knowledge that are really, really hard to learn. So you think back to Socrates when he tried to show that the rationality, the rational method is available to people regardless of education. And he took a slave boy and taught him a complex geometrical proof. What makes this probably unpleasant with slave boy was probably accompanied by a variety of beatings until he managed to actually acquire this complex geometrical proof. But we don't have to look far for other things that are hard to acquire, right? So for instance, literacy is something that's very language related, but it is very dependent on your intelligence, and it's very dependent on overt instruction, and it's very dependent on your attention span, right? So if you're lacking any one of these areas, you're probably not going to acquire literacy. And you know, the same would apply to history, or to, you know, learning Latin from a book, the second language acquisition, etc. So then we have this puzzle work. You know, there are some things that are easy to learn, some things that are hard to learn. How can we account for that? And so this broad puzzle has been synthesized into a number of research questions which we can actually talk about in a formal way. And these are, what constitutes knowledge of language? This is known as Humboldt's problem. How is this knowledge acquired, which is also called Plato's problem. And what you'll notice about these two questions is that they're very, very much focused on mind things, right? It's about knowledge in your mind. And these two questions that drove the first cognitive revolution in the 60s and 70s. I think though, starting maybe in the 70s, but only really gathering impetus in this century, is the question of how does the biology of this stuff work out? And so to these two biolinguistic questions, we're going to add two more, which are, what are the relevant brain mechanisms, and how does this knowledge evolve in species? Okay. And implicit in this is a real position, right? It's that the stuff of language must be real in the sense that it must be biological, so it must be genetic in some sense. And what we notice here is these two sets of questions, the one of the mind questions, the other one of the very biology questions, which suggests that, you know, since this is the biolinguistic synthesis, that there is some rapprochement between these two parts, the mind and material. And maybe that means unification at some point, maybe that just means agree to disagree, we don't know. That's part of the ongoing research project that hopefully this century will be busy. Okay. So according to Jenkins 2000, there's been an explosion of knowledge around the first two questions, namely Humboldt's and Plato's problems, from studies of languages and dialects that now number in thousands, from Afrikaans to Zapotec. Evidence bearing on these is now available from numerous areas: syntax, semantics, phonology, phonetics, morphology, and traditional linguistic areas, including language acquisition, studies of language change, SLI, language perception, sign language, and increasingly from neurology, from fMRI scans and things like that. So there's a wide variety of information now that we can draw on to triangulate about what it is that, you know, constitutes knowledge of language. So let's go through these two problems in turn. First of all, Humboldt's problem: what is language? And at this point, I think there is a potential for a split amongst people about how to approach this. So let's back up a little bit and not think about language, but think about something concrete like the human hand. So there's two ways of approaching the study of the human hand. You could take a structuralist perspective and say, well, what does it consist of? What is its material? And say, well, you know, there's a certain bone structure, there are knuckles, various joints, sinews, veins, I don't know, skin, fingerprints. There's stuff that makes this up. And from that, we can infer its function. We can work out that given its structure, it can be used for grasping. Given its structure, it can be used for punching, or picking your nose, or pointing at people, etc. The other way of approaching this is from a more functionalist perspective, right? So, well, let's enumerate all the possible things you could use your hand for. Well, I can use it to, scratch my eye, and I can use it to punch, and I can use it to manipulate, certainly. But I can use it also for caressing and loving, and for murdering someone, right? And it just seems to me that if you take the structuralist perspective, you have a finite number of things you can possibly say about structure. Right? You can say there are X amount of bones, there are X amount of veins and sinews, and from that you can infer something. Whereas if you go from the other perspective, it seems to me a lot more difficult to do, because you have potentially infinite number of functions from which you must infer some kind of form. And it strikes me as hard. Okay. So coming back to language, what would knowledge about language be? So first of all, I think it's clear that it must include a massive lexicon, which is structured in some way, and which seems to be infinitely extendable when it comes to lexical items. So for instance, if I told you that there's a special word for the gap between the wall and the picture frame there, that is a word you could use when you next to redecorate your house and you could impress the interior designer no end. But if I told you, hey, there's this new passive that we can learn, I think that would be actually really quite hard, right? Or if I said, hey, let's all decide to, have ergativity all of a sudden, right? That would be almost impossible to do. And basically, so in contrast to this extendable lexicon, we also have a finite set of functional categories which exist in some kind of steady state, and which I'm going to say they don't ever change, except when people learn a new language. So then, new tenses, new determiners, etc. Other parts about what language must be would include a derivation or mapping between form and meaning. So this is basically Saussure. Saussure's signs were between signified and signifier, but they were kind of very static. You just got this like lump of, and there's a mapping between the two. What syntax does is creates that derivation, well, creates that mapping between signifier and signified, what we call aleph and pf, in a dynamic way. So we take a sentence to be a complex Saussurean sign. There has to be something about how that happens in the mind or the brain. Language must include some kind of recursion or hierarchy, discrete infinity, and I think perhaps something that maybe one of the most important discoveries of late 20th century linguistics is domains and islands. So we know that, which we didn't know before, right, is that a lot of grammatical phenomena are defined by a domain. So for instance, principle A and principle B are very good examples of this, where whether you can have an anaphor in referring to something depends very much on whether that something it refers to, its antecedents, in the same clause or not. An island is something that seems to have a function but without any form, right? So for instance, these are sentences that are ineffable in some way. So you know what you want to say, and you can explain, I want to say this, I want to ask this kind of question, but you can't, and it seems to be ruled out for purely grammatical reasons. So an example of this is, you can say something like, who saw what? Not a problem, but it's actually completely word salad. Say, what did who see? Okay. Now we all know that it would be useful to be able to ask that question, to be able to ask an object question in the context of a WH question word in the subject position, but you can't. It's ruled out for purely formal reasons. And there are lots of these, right? There are WH islands, there are movement islands, there's coordinate structure constraints, a particularly strong island that seems to be, I'm going to say, universal, because that makes the debate fun. Okay. And I think so. This is really important, right? So you have the knowledge of how these things come to be is surely part of your competence. And then I also think, what strikes me is that there are clear and obvious similarities in the structural organizations of language. I'm not talking about word order universals here or anything like that, but if you actually do some linguistic analysis, and you'll notice that in language after language we see these similarities, right? So for instance, at the most broad level, the CP level, which is kind of like mood, etc., dominates the inflectional layer, which is about tense and agreement and things like that. And the inflectional layer dominates the light V layer, which is about agentivity, defining the nature of events, etc. And that in turn dominates the deep V layer, which is about aspect and direct objects and indirect objects and things like that. And if you can read any number of journals and you'll find that structure iterated again and again and again, which is to say that the theory the linguistic theories we use actually does transfer to novel languages. So all these things are probably must somehow be constitute knowledge of language. So what equipment, what tools do we need to represent these structures? And at this point, I think we get another theoretical split where people are going to disagree. So let's say there's the distinction between those who are committed to representation and those who aren't. Let's call them the postmodernists. So by representation, the representationalists are going to say there is an intrinsic good to having a representation that is amenable to human reason. Okay, that we can write down and say this is the analysis of that, and we can do something with that. Some more postmodernist view, and I'm going to lump radical connectionists in this, is actually they're not really worried about the representation at all. What you have is inputs and outputs in some kind of a neural network, and we're really interested in how accurately are the inputs mapped to the outputs. But if you read the the connectionist literature, there's not a lot of language description that comes out of that. The description, the representation is highly abstract, little numbers on nodes that are connected together in kind of complicated ways. So it's very difficult to say, we've trained neural network, and from that we can work out any kind of linguistic description at all. Okay, the representation is completely unavailable to human reason. So let's go down the representationalist road. There are, I think, two kinds of representationalists. There are those who are committed to some kind of realism, to say that the structures we create are real in the sense that they are somewhere located in the mind and the brain. So when you talk about tree structures or ordered sets or whatever kind of a mathematical thing we're using to model those things, that those things exist as real things, okay? Naturally encoded into neurons, etc., but nevertheless that they are real. The other tradition goes back to Ernst Mach and Maxwell and Fourier, who argued that they could create algebraic abstractions of things that were not necessarily real, but which represented the data pretty well. And it's only many, many years later, after Maxwell's equations, that people were able to say, oh, you know what, we can integrate this into some kind of thermodynamic. So there are two types of representationalists. So at this point, I still haven't committed to any kind of nativism. I will, don't you worry. Don't you worry. Okay, so what equipment do we need to represent these structures? Well, I think the first thing we need is a commitment to actually represent something. And that is to say, to take the responsibility to impose a schema of some kind on the continuity of experience. And that is, learn a lexicon, right? You can attribute various labels to various things in your experience. And let's call that digitization, the willingness to break up your world into bits, okay? And the moment you are committed to that, you can have a commitment to features of some kind, okay? So that's absolutely essential. And this will be knowledge of lexicon. We need that in order to get linguistics or syntactic structures to work. It's all very well saying, reality is some kind of continuum. Yeah, sure it is. But, you can say, well, look, you've got a predisposition to see the world as happening dynamic things and static nounish things, and let's grammaticalize those onto nouns and verbs, right? But the point here is that this fluid state is grammaticalized into two particular things. And when you look at nouns and verbs, they have rather distinct properties. So let's take a hard one. Destroy, destruction, right? So who knows? Is destroy, destruction a noun or a verb, or an event of some kind? Because, here's two sentences that have exactly the same propositional value. If I say Scipio destroyed Carthage, or Scipio's destruction of Carthage, right? In both cases it refers to the same event, but what we notice is that the object in the first one is case marked by the verb, and the second one is case marked with its preposition. And why? Because the continuum of experience doesn't case mark anything. Grammar does. And it does so in binary ways. So verbs case mark, prepositions case mark, nouns may not case mark. And from this, we get data. Okay. What else do we need to know? What other representational devices do we need? Well, we need some way of putting things together. And these are the three basic operations of the minimalist program, which is merge, move, and agree. Merge is basically putting categories together in a particular kind of way. It's not just lumping together into let's turn your hat upside down and put some nouns and verbs in there. It's putting them together in a recursive way, which is to say you put two things together and they create something of the same kind, which you can then put together something else which creates something of the same kind. In mathematical terms, this is actually the creation of partially ordered sets as opposed to just plain set. Move is moving things around in trees, and some people have said, well, merge and move are actually pretty much the same thing. It's really about representing something more than once in your set structure. So maybe merge and move are just one thing. And then we have agree, which is basically about creating links between various categories in the tree or in your set structure. So that's all you need. Merge, move and agree, and a willingness to build a lexicon. If you can do that, you can do syntax. Not quite. We need to work out if these are the universals, or the things that are common to language, where does the variation come in? And it comes in the idea of principles and parameters, which are probably the principles I've already talked about, merge, move, and agree. The parameters are best thought of perhaps as features in the lexicon. So if you have a preposition in your lexicon with agreement 5 features on it, it's going to cause you to have an agreeing preposition, which might mean that the noun phrase associated with the preposition will move to the specifier, which is going to get you a certain kind of a postpositional order, and that might have effects for island or down the line. Or if I have, in my lexicon, I have EPP feature on T, it means I'm going to have a subject initial language. If I don't have that, I'm going to have a pro-drop language. So this is where the parameters, this is where language variation comes from. They're just features in the lexicon. And since you're already committed to having a lexicon, and since you're already committed to the lexicon being something that is, where all the random stuff about languages, it actually makes sense to have the parameters yet. So that's syntax, right? Right? That's what we teach up to 3 years of linguistics for the undergrads. Okay, so that's what constitutes knowledge of language. Merge, move, agree, some features, and a willingness to binarize them all. Which comes to Plato's problem. Where does this apparatus come from? And at this point, I'm going to commit to some kind of innatist perspective. So there are, I think, a number of different ways of thinking about where the apparatus comes from, and people are going to disagree on this, right? So let's deal with a straw man first. The first one is that this knowledge, this apparatus comes from, it is discursively constructed in society. Okay, so I mean, this is postmodern and inherently dualist, and I've got nothing else to say about it. So,
Inherently? It is inherently?
it is inherently postmodern and dualist.
And dualist.
And dualist. And it's just rubbish. Okay. Okay. So that's a straw man. Let's not even go down that road. The other possibility is that all this stuff is 100% innate. But, no one's actually had that idea, or no one's actually had that position since the medieval king apparently locked up some children in his closet and waited for them to break forth into spontaneous Hebrew. Because we know that learning language is an interaction of something that must happen in society. So, Afrikaans children grow up speaking Afrikaans, and Japanese children grow up speaking Japanese. Clearly there's something social about that. So the 100% innatist view is just ridiculous, okay? And no one has it. And Descartes didn't have it. And Chomsky's never had it. So we can just put that to the one side and say, well, let's move on to something more interesting. The other view, which is actually not a straw man, is that this knowledge is 100% from experience. Okay, this is a classic view of Hume and Locke. But also in more recent times, we're looking at Skinner. It's the behaviorist paradigm. And even more recent radical connectionism espouses this kind of view. Where basically you have inputs and outputs, and there's Hebbian learning happens, what fires together, wires together. And from that you get this emergent stuff that, creates language as it goes along. Okay. So this is a valid position, right? We can actually argue with this, and there are people that will take it, and I guess. Then there is the nativist position, which is that this knowledge of language is some stuff that is innate and some stuff that is contributed by experience. That is the nativist position. Not that everything is innate, because that just won't work, because you can't learn the lexicon innately. It just could not happen. It's a ridiculous perspective. Okay. So I guess that's all I really want to say for now. So what I have said, I've outlined the basic bilinguistic position. I've tried to show how it's got two sets of questions, namely mind questions and more biology kinds of questions. And I've gone through each of the mind questions in turn, namely Humboldt's problem and Plato's problem, to try and just work out statements, to stake the territory out. Thank you.
Moving on to practice. I'm an empiricist, so I need to read from my papers. But to work on the boredom, I have some slides, and we can look at the slides and don't have to look at me. Okay, Mark, I am going to spell out a few specific details of how I understand the nativist position. I obviously picked those parts that I like to disagree with. But I think it's more or less consistent with what you said, if slightly more specific in some ways. Just as a broad preface before I get to this, I think what I want to sketch now, what I'll emphasize from the notes that I prepared, is that a typical empiricist position would start from function and then move to form. And gradients would be more important than discrete categories in our thinking. I am not a radical connectionist, although I'm quite partial to radical emergentism, which is not quite the same. So if there are universals, they are of a semantic kind and not of a syntactic kind, in view of our team. Okay. Let's identify a few important observations that motivate, in my mind, the nativist position. There's an underlying assumption that is spelled out quite overtly in various places by Chomsky and Pinker and many others, that language is quite complex, that it's a hard thing to learn, and that's what creates Plato's problem. Because it's so hard to learn, and yet kids succeed in doing it so effortlessly, clearly they must have some extra help. They can't do it all on their own. This complexity is typically related to two properties in particular, that language is structure dependent and that it displays the property of recursivity. Now, structure dependency is the property that transformations or movements or whatever you want to call it, depending on which decade you learned your syntax, target not the linear order of words, but their position in an invisible hierarchical structure of categories. A classical illustration of this property comes from W.H. movement, where an interrogative pronoun or adverb that is deeply embedded in a tree structure is extracted. So it sort of starts there, deep in the structure. We can draw a tree. I can perhaps set this as a test for those of you who've recently done some syntax. Draw a nice derivation of this one to show that that T there is quite deep, and yet it ends up right at the beginning. And then we get some really nice ones like, who did Mary hope that Tom would tell Bill that he should visit? With 4 layers of embedding. Nice. So that's structure dependency. Recursivity is the property where a structure that belongs to a particular category can be embedded in a higher structure of the same kind.